So, welcome to the latest episode of MQ's Open Minds. And today, Craig and I are delighted. We've got Professor Mick Cooper. Mick's a professor of counselling psychology at Roehampton and is also an author, a trainer, and a UKCP-registered psychotherapist. So, welcome to the podcast,
Thanks,
Mick.
Rory.
Great to have you here. And
Thank you.
so, what we try and do in the podcast, we keep it pretty natural, we hope, but we always start with asking tell us about your journey into mental health. You obviously have been involved in mental health for many years. I see you did starting off as your undergraduate, your social psychology degree. You completed that in 1998, and then your DPhil, in the 90s. So you've been involved in psychology, and then obviously moved into the mental health field thereafter. So can you tell us a bit about your journey? What interested in the first place?
I started off doing a psychology degree. I was in the sciences before and got interested in psychology because I wanted to do something as an undergraduate that was more human focused. And I guess as an undergraduate, I started studying the work of Carl Rogers, and for the first time read a book that really spoke to me at a very kind of personal, emotional level, really. Something that was the idea that we all wear masks and that there's something deep in our experiences that often doesn't get spoken about, and the idea of being able to be true to ourselves. I was really taken with it. So I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do after that when I was traveling. Certainly wasn't thinking at that point I was going to be a therapist or a practicing psychologist. Thought about maybe doing media, but was kind of really, and then really struggled in my 20s. Was really lost, just didn't have a sense of where I was going. Lots of closed doors, but found an opportunity to do a PhD around the psychology of masks. Bizarrely, I got asked a few questions around that in COVID. I was interested in what happens when people put a mask in the kind of transformation.
Yeah.
And thought if I'm going to do a psychology PhD, I should probably do something useful at the same time. So I did a counselling training, started doing a counselling training.
Alongside the PhD?
Yeah. It was just a year's kind of certificate. And it wasn't really, I mean, it was flagged as a counselling training. It was one of those things that at the last moment I thought, I saw an advert in the Guardian and thought I'd go for it. It was one of these incredible, it was so unstructured that you sat there for probably the first term or so in a room of about 60, 70 people. You didn't even know who the trainers were. You just kind of sat there trying to work out what was going on, which was, that was kind of the training. But I liked it. And, the level of conversation about experiencing and relationships and what goes on in a group was incredibly powerful, really, and was something that I guess I felt I wanted to stay involved in. And again, after that, there was a year and thought maybe I'll carry on training. And then a few years later, went and decided to do a kind of proper diploma training, and then went on to complete a UKCP training, which was 4 years. And then about 10 years later, qualified as a psychologist, so became a counselling psychologist. So it wasn't something I kind of sat out and said, right, I'm going to be a therapist or a psychologist. Kind of just found my way into it through different routes. But what I would say is that from a really early age, I was very politically involved. So I was involved in my parents were very progressive. I was always very progressive. That as a student, I was very involved in student politics, and a kind of social justice issues really mattered to me. So I guess therapy was in some ways a way of seeing myself as being able to make some kind of social contribution, and that was important, and I think that's why I did it alongside the PhD, because I didn't want to just do something theoretical. I wanted to do something that would make a difference to people's lives as well.
So in terms of the PhD though, so what was the PhD on?
So it was on Mars. It was on what happens when you
so the whole
Mars.
PhD was on masks. Okay, right.
It was on Mars, and it was about actually how masks bring out these different sides of ourselves. And if people maybe pop in a chat or somewhere, my website, because I actually write about doing the PhD, I had a disastrous experience. I got to the end of it, and the examiners basically hated it, and I had to rewrite the whole thing from scratch. And spent 8 years on it after I did 4 years, and then had to rewrite it, which was horrible. A learning experience, but not one I'd want to repeat.
My God. But so hold on. Was it interview based then?
It was kind of theoretical. It was I started off doing it as cultural studies, and
okay,
moved
right.
into psychology. And what happened was basically the examiners were psychologists. I'd done it as a kind of cultural studies. Let's look at masks across cultures and in literature. So I was writing about things like Batman and the way that Batman's mask brings out different sides in the Joker. And of course, these psychologists looked at it and thought, what the hell is this? So I had to go and do 4 years of empirical research into it.
Wow. Well, that was dedication to the cause, but I dare say it didn't feel
Or
like that at the time.
stupidity.
So then you moved in. So you were, oh, so that all happened in Sussex. And then, so where did you go when you left Sussex then?
I was at Regent's College and I did so that's where I did my existential psychotherapy training. And that was it really. I was teaching at University of Brighton, then I went up to University of Strathclyde in Glasgow and then came back to the University of Roehampton. So those are the main institutions that I've been.
Mhm.
Yeah, but I did my training at Regent's College in London
Yeah.
as a psychotherapist.
And then you were in Scotland for quite a while. Was it what,
Yeah,
how many years? Is it 10 years
10
more?
years.
Yeah,
It's very wet up in Glasgow.
it is. Well, as I well know, it's wet, but as we speak at this moment, though, it's not raining. So it's worse as I look out my window.
It was amazing to get back down south and see the sun. Literally, it was like 10 years. And I looked up, I remember looking up when I moved back down again and seeing blue sky and thinking, what is that? I've
Well,
never
there's also
seen
blue
that
skies
before.
today, so I will have to say
I'm
that as
being
well.
unfair.
Yeah, but you also obviously I know obviously Strathclyde was obviously famous for counselling, and
Yep.
I was it Dave Mearns and his
Yep.
person-centered work.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there was a massive, it was a real homeland of person and still is actually. I mean, they still do some fantastic person-centered training there. So I got very involved in that, but then kind of moved more into counseling psychology and what we'll maybe talk about later, kind of more pluralistic rather than purely person-centered approach.
Well, so do you want to tell us a bit because
Yeah.
maybe a lot of our listenership wouldn't be
Yeah.
familiar with the different types of counseling psychology or the different the sort of
Yeah,
approaches.
no, it's a really good question. So, I mean, there's a lot of different terminology about, but person-centered therapy is an approach that really tries to begin with the client, with the sometimes it's called client-centered therapy as well. It really tries to start and not impose on them any expectations, any biases, any techniques or methods. It really tries to provide an empathic, valuing space where the client can talk about things at their own pace in their own way. It's kind of based on the belief that clients have the answers within them and that rather than the expert, the therapist being the expert who comes in and says, you should do this or you should do this or what about this technique or try this, that actually rather than doing that, they listen very carefully to the person and help them understand more about their own experiences, their own ways of perceiving the world and kind of learning to trust, I guess, those inner forces that those inner needs and wants that allow them then to find the best way for themselves. So rather than coming in from the outside and saying you should be doing this, it's more about helping the person from the inside work out for themselves what it is that they want to do. So that's the kind of person-centered approach. Pluralistic approach. So I was very involved in that. And I guess, as I was saying before, I came from a social justice background and was very interested in more progressive politics. So for me, that idea that clients were the experts and that the relationship wasn't a hierarchical one of I'm the professional, I know you're the client, I need to teach you these things, but was more a collaborative one. We're working together. It was really important to me and I really valued that. And I loved the approach and still love the approach and was involved in writing, co-editing handbooks and different texts on it. But one of the things that we found was that actually, when we really listened to clients and said to people, what is it that you want in therapy? Kind of paradoxically, a lot of the time people would say, I want guidance and I want techniques and I want advice. And so if you go back to them and you say, well, you kind of think you want that, but actually what you really want is space and being listened to, then there's kind of a bit of a contradiction there because you're kind of then going back into the expert position of telling people what they need. So the pluralistic approach that John McLeod, who was up at University of Aberdeen, myself and colleagues developed and is still being kind of developed and disseminated, and we have regular conferences, was very much on a similar idea that we really want to listen to clients about what it is that they want, but rather than kind of assuming that what everybody wants is a listening open space, is recognizing that people want lots of different things. And actually, we know from the research that lots and lots of different ways can be helpful for clients. And it doesn't make too much sense to get too locked down into person-centered or there's other approaches like psychodynamic or existential. The research shows that most of them are pretty effective. There's not a lot of evidence that some are more effective than others. And actually, also importantly, different approaches are likely to help different people at different
Mhm.
points in time. That there isn't one right approach for everyone, whether that's person-centered or CBT or psychodynamic. So what we've done in the pluralistic approach is to try and find ways of understanding more about what clients want. For instance, we developed a form and inventory of preferences, which we can use at the beginning of therapy to ask clients, do you want something that is, where the therapy is more directive, or would you like to take more of a lead? Do you want more of emotional
Okay.
kind of work, or do you want something that's a bit more emotionally reserved? Do you want something that's more challenging and more supportive? So it tries to bring out more of the client's voice in a
So
way.
is it more than like a framework then? And then you can do underpin that framework, you can do either whatever psychodynamic, CBT, or whatever it might be.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's 450 different kinds of therapy out there. Nobody's going to be skilled in every single one.
Yeah.
So it's not about doing every kind of therapy, but it's about valuing and recognizing the value of different therapies. And then within the limits of what we can train in and what we know and what we want to do, being able to have some, not even necessarily flexibility, just respect for these other approaches. I think it's really important that therapists kind of recognize the value of the work that other therapists do. And the reality is that the therapy field can get pretty bitchy, for want of a better word.
Yeah. Yeah.
It can be pretty dismissive towards other approaches. And it can be like, my approach is better than yours, what we might call schoolism. And, that's not, it's not grown up. And more importantly, it's really not helpful for clients. I mean, I remember as a young person going to a behavioral therapist, he said to me, I don't believe in all that counselling, it's all, a bit rubbishy. And actually, that was the counselling I was having as well as a behavioral therapy was really helpful for me. The counsellor was also very skeptical about the behavioral therapy.
Yeah.
That wasn't about me and my needs. That was about them and their egos, their professional egos, their needs to feel like what they were doing was of value as opposed to something else. So I think pluralism tries to kind of move away from that and develop a field in which we can really respect based on the evidence, which shows that lots of different things help people at different points in time. We don't have to do everything, but I think there is an onus on therapists in the service of clients to be able to respect what other people are doing and what other professionals are doing.
And so have you seen, is there progress in that regard then, that is there more respect now in comparing now than 10 years ago or 20 years ago?
If you look in the States, that most of the therapists there, something like 90% plus, will draw on multiple methods in their work. And I
Mm-hmm.
think in the UK, yeah, I think that there is more respect across the different therapies. If you look back like 20, 30 years ago, you had not just the person-centered people sometimes being very critical of CBT and seeing CBT as very kind of lightweight and not really going in very deeply. You also had CBT people in their research studies, for instance, would often compare against the kind of straw man person-centered therapy. That I mean, sometimes they'd have this thing they call person-centered therapy, but it would be delivered by CBT nurses, supervised by CBT people. Clearly wasn't bona fide person-centered therapy. And you kind of get less of that. And I think it's partly because the research shows that generally, for what we know, the different therapies seem to be as good as each other. I think there is more respect across the field now, and people kind of recognize that different therapies can be of value. And I think that's got to be a healthy thing for clients more than anyone else.
Yeah, and I suppose there's also the growing recognition that in terms of the active ingredients, I think often we don't know what the active ingredients of the different therapies are, A, and then B, but we do know that the relationship building, the therapeutic alliance is so fundamental. And so I suppose if whatever helps build that has to be crucial then.
Yeah, and I mean most therapies really, I mean, sometimes people say that CBT is not a relational approach, but if you read Beck, if you read any of the work, it's really got the relationship built in, as does psychodynamic, as does humanistic approaches, person-centered approaches. So it is all that. But even with a question like the relationship, from a pluralistic standpoint, we'd say, well, yeah, the relationship and working collaboratively is really important. But then for some clients, it might not be what they need. They might not need a relationship at all. They might actually do better with a workbook, or they might do quite well, watching a film or getting involved in literature or going to a sports club. That actually, different things can help different people outside of just therapy and outside of the therapeutic relationship. So you can, when I was in my kind of 30s, I was really kind of gung ho for the therapeutic relationship and really saw that as the kind of be all and end all of therapy. And actually, the research doesn't show that. It shows that there's a really good association between relational fact, the quality of the relationship and outcomes, we don't actually know whether that means that the relationship is driving the outcomes. There's kind of emerging evidence that probably some of that's going on. But, not everybody needs a relationship. And if it was all about the relationship, then the more relational therapies like person-centered therapies would be doing better overall than more maybe technique-based therapies like CBT. And they don't. They seem to do equally well, generally.
Yeah, but I suppose, yeah, that's I suppose a fair point. But I suppose I wonder to what extent, though, if you've got a good therapeutic relationship, obviously builds trust, makes it more likely you will engage with the therapy better. I mean, a whole range of other behavioral as well as cognitive outcomes.
Yeah.
So but I suppose what you're saying, I think, is that we don't know enough about it yet in terms of the evidence.
Yeah, we know that. I mean, certainly qualitative evidence would support that. I think that's about as that as much as we do know, that's one of the things that we can be about as certain of as anything else. But you're right, there is still a lot more that we need to find out. I mean, people often say that the most important determinant of outcomes in therapy is the relationship. Actually, it's not, it's client factors. It's things like the client's level of motivation, whether the client engages with the therapy, factors about the client, about whether the client can use therapy. Do they? One of the things we find actually, which is a shame in some ways, is that there's kind of a law that the rich get richer than the poor in therapy, meaning that where somebody's got quite good relational skills and ability to attach securely, where they're psychologically minded, generally the evidence suggests that they tend to get more out of psychotherapy than clients who are maybe poorer attachments and find relating more difficult, which is a shame. You'd kind of hope it was the other way around in some ways. But client factors, therapists sometimes think that therapy is like we make the change happen, but of course it's not. It's more like, the client is the one who's driving the car. We're sitting there more like, if anything, a driving instructor or a passenger kind of helping them along to get to where they want to go. It's not us driving the car.
Absolutely, but I suppose what was a disappointing thing. What you're saying is that arguably the people who most need it, we're going to talk about social change and inequalities, but it's sadly in many cases that depending what you're bringing to the therapy can be obviously a barrier to the success, and that could be obviously socially patterned and lead to even greater inequality, which is obviously sad. But I suppose there must be ways in which there's been great examples over the years of people being able to overcome those inequalities. So I mean, are there any tips you can think of? Might put you on the spot here of how we can help people to maybe tackle that inequality?
Well, I mean, just go to unpack that a little bit more, Rory. I think you're absolutely right. So one of the best predictors of how well people can do in therapy is the levels of social support. And people with low levels of social support can struggle more to make good use of therapy. I mean, it's not that it doesn't help them, but it's just if you've got good social support, people tend to use therapy better. But I think that, when we come on to things like social factors like poverty, racism, poor housing, I think it's really important to recognize that psychotherapy can't solve everything, and that there are issues and that there are, inequalities that psychotherapy isn't developed and isn't appropriate, and it would be a misuse of therapy and a kind of undermining and a misrecognition of the problems people are facing to think that therapy is going to solve. I mean, it's complex. Potentially therapy can empower people in a way that can then help them challenge inequalities. What you get in the States is that in the counselling world in the States, where they've really developed multicultural and social justice competencies a lot, things like advocacy have become much more part of the counselling role. So that whereas when I was trained, that if a client comes in with something like a housing form and says, "Can you help me with my housing form?" we were kind of trained to, be horrified and go, "What is it that you would want me to do that?" But in the States now with advocacy, it's like, okay, yeah, no, this is something I can maybe help you with. And, I think there's more of a crossover and a kind of recognition of what can help with what. But I think that, I'd be reluctant to say, well, here's examples where therapy have helped people really get over these social and economic adversities, because I think that there's a risk of implying that, I don't know, that these inequalities are things that people bring on themselves or that they can choose to overcome, or it's all about kind of having willpower and you can be whoever you want to be. And I think there's probably a small minority of people in the therapy world who think that, but I think most people in the therapy world would recognize that, what we do is within a particular context, and there's there's complex relationships, and the organization Therapy and Social Change Network is very much about exploring that interface between therapeutic change and psychological change, and that's particularly the work I've kind of been involved in recently.
Okay, we'll move on to the Therapy and Social Change Network in a wee second, as you've just mentioned it. But just one last question on the pluralistic approach. So in terms of implementing that in practice, you're saying what you've developed a checklist or some approach at the start of the sessions to tell us a bit about how that works in practice.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends how therapists are trained and what they're working. So you might have somebody who's mainly, say, a person-centered therapist, or somebody who's mainly CBT. You might have somebody who's integrative, and what means integrative is that they would kind of draw on different approaches into their work, and maybe that they've got a wider range of practices. Either of them can be within a pluralistic approach, though. So what you do is you'd sit with a client and you'd talk to them and you'd introduce yourself and find out about what's going on for them, maybe what they want to get out of therapy. And then what I would do is I'd say to the client, can you tell me a little bit about maybe what you think would be helpful here, particularly to get to these goals? Have you been in therapy before? Is there things that have been helpful for you or not helpful for you in therapy that maybe we could learn from? And then I might introduce this form, this inventory, and say, it might be useful, if you're okay, just to fill that in. And, that will give us a bit of an indication of how you'd like the therapy to be. And then we talk about it. And it might be something like that the form shows that they got a strong preference for, therapist directiveness. And then we might talk about what does that mean. So it's not that they fill in a form and then you go, right,
Yeah.
but I think a lot of it, we've done research on clients' experiences of it and how they find it. And a lot of it, I think, is just about, well, we'll go back to what you were saying, Rory, is about building the relationship, really, and saying, this is an opportunity for us to work together to help address the things you want to address. And that's very much how I see therapy, as a collaborative enterprise, not as some kind of technique. And it's not like I want to be collaborative, because I think that is the best thing for you is if clients come with problems, generally there's not some easy simple solution. It's not just that I'm sitting there thinking, oh, if only they did this or only they did that. When you really listen to somebody and understand what somebody's going through, problems are, this phrase, wicked problems. Most problems people come to therapy with are wicked problems. And if I'm sitting there thinking, oh, there's an obvious answer to it, it's probably that I'm not listening closely enough.
Sorry, what do you mean by wicked problems?
Wicked problems are kind of really complex, entangled problems, really difficult problems that, you find a solution to it one way, but actually that raises problems from another angle. So it's not that there is an easy answer to it. It's not just you do A or you do B, but actually you kind of have to untangle it like a really kind of tied, like when your shoelaces are all tied up and you can't undo them. It's like that kind of thing. And I think, in my experience as a therapist, nearly always the issues that clients bring are of that type, that we kind of untangle it little bit by little bit, and hopefully, and it's very rare actually as a therapist, in my experience, that you get to the point where something is completely untangled. That most clients, or a lot of clients, have been through different episodes of therapy and have different change processes, and you kind of work with them along and do a little bit of untangling, and then they maybe see somebody else and they untangle things a little bit more. And people always have kind of tangles in their lives.
So moving on then, so go on. So you mentioned there a Therapy and Social Change Network. So you can tell us a bit about that, because I'm going to move on. I'm really keen to talk about your most recent book, Psychology at the Heart of Social Change.
Yeah, I mean, they're very related. So the Therapy and Social Change Network is a very kind of loose group of people, mainly therapists, although we're hoping it will be a wider group, and it's very much open to everybody, where we're exploring how internal change and psychological change relates to wider political and social change. And there's a number of different areas of that. So partly that's about how therapy can be informed by a social justice perspective, like taking into account factors like people's cultural backgrounds, looking at issues like sexism, racism in the therapy room, looking at issues of power and privilege and marginalization, and what that means for therapy, using kind of ideas that, and also in training. I mean, training is another important area. Also research. I mean, there's loads of really good research from the States coming out, for instance, around microaggressions and how clients, black clients, say working with a white therapist, can experience microaggressions.
Do you want to tell people what microaggressions are, just in case they don't know?
Yeah, microaggressions are, I mean, it's not an area of my expertise, but as I understand it, they're kind of like not explicitly racist statements, but it might be something like mispronounced. Say I'm working with an Indian client and I might just kind of keep on say something like, oh, that's really hard to say your name. Can I just use a nickname or something? It's not kind of explicitly, I don't like Indian people, but it is, there's a racism there in that it's not putting the effort in to actually understand a different culture. Unfortunately, that does happen in therapy. There's interesting questions about how, as a therapist, so if you're a black therapist or a white therapist, you deal with racism or anti-Semitism. And so there's all those issues about how social justice comes into therapy. Also around like training, like at the moment in the therapy world, still it is very, very white. And how do we bring people from more marginalized backgrounds into therapy training so it can be more representative? But then the other side of it, and I guess where my book's particularly interested in, is then also how can therapy contribute towards a more socially just landscape? And does therapy have any role, or rather, what role does it have in helping to create a world that is fairer, more peaceful, more thriving? So the network is about we have seminars, we have podcasts, we have conferences, we have WhatsApp groups, Facebook groups, but it's very kind of loose network of people just on the kind of left of the spectrum. It's not trying to represent the whole political spectrum. It's from people who are interested in social justice perspectives, thinking about how that feeds into therapy.
And if people want to find out more about the network, how do they do that? How do they find out?
Therapyandsocialchange.net, or just look up Therapy and Social Change Network, and people are very welcome to become involved in it. It's just one. I mean, there's lots of different groups. There's the Black and Asian Therapist Network that's going. There's a group called Psychotherapists and Counselors for Social Responsibility. We're not trying to kind of colonize a marketplace, which would be ironic. There's lots of different groups, and I think we try and just be one of several groups that are trying to explore this space at the moment.
Okay, well, it sounds fascinating, really important work, obviously, especially, I think, what do you think in the UK context of looking at just going through cost of living crisis, and we know it's just leading to greater inequalities, and I mean, these large, massive top-level structural factors are really, if we're looking at the key drivers to mental health, I mean, they're so important. And indeed, we did at MQ last year, we published this, often mentioned it in the podcast, the Gone Too Soon project, which we brought together experts from around the world. And we were looking at what the key factors were, which lead to the premature mortality associated with mental illness and mental distress. So primarily from suicide or from sort of comorbidities associated with mental illness. And obviously, number one came up time and time again is inequalities, disadvantage, stigmatization, racism, discrimination, gender-based violence. I mean, and it's, if we really are serious about tackling these inequalities, that's where that level of intervention is required. Yeah. But I suppose that sets up quite nicely. And sorry, Mick, to talk about your latest book. Obviously, you've written quite a few books. How many books have you written?
About 10.
10 books.
Too many, and that was my last one.
Well, I haven't even said. So is it definitely your last one?
No.
I was going to say the last, as in the most recent, I suppose.
No, as in the last one I ever want to write. But yeah, I'm just working on another one.
Okay, we can tell us about that in a second. But so this one came out, I think, last year, and it's called, the full title is Psychology at the Heart of Social Change: Developing a Progressive Vision for Society. So, no, a pretty grand title there. Right? So I haven't had a chance to read it. So tell us what it's about, and do you live up to that grand title?
I live up to that? I mean, I want to answer that. I just want to go back to what you were saying, Rory, about inequalities in it. I mean, absolutely. That's what the evidence shows. And it really worries me as a therapist that so much of the therapy world is not ignorant, but just is not taking that into account, and it's not joined up. So much of therapy focuses on individual suffering, and we bring clients in, we work with clients, we work on internal psychological issues, self-esteem, really important work. But as you say, there are these massive, big structural factors that are causing psychological distress. And in some way, these things need to be joined up. And the counselling world, the psychotherapy world, the psychology world, we need to be joined up with the kind of amazing research you're doing. That sounds fantastic, Rory. But anyway, yeah, I mean, the book is looking at it, I guess, from the other angle, the other way around. And it is saying, what can therapy and the world of therapy and ideas from therapy contribute to a fairer world? And I think the way that the book goes into that is to say that actually, as therapy, we absolutely don't have all the answers. I mean, it's not in any way saying, it's about developing, contributing, maybe making some, if we're going to have the real subtitle, it'd be something like trying to make the best contribution we can make, even if it might be a little bit marginal towards a progressive society, kind of recognizing the limits. But I think the book is particularly aimed at, I guess, progressive parties and the left, and saying that there are things that we've learned in the therapy world that are really valuable. And I do mean that, actually. I do think that means really valuable. And I think that's particularly targeted, sometimes on the left, sometimes with progressive positions. They can get very black and white themselves. They can get very demonizing of other positions. They can be, you just need to watch PMQs about kind of, I'm right, you're wrong, we're good, we're in a good position, you're in a bad position, rather than kind of recognizing the basic humanity of others and engaging with people's basic humanity. We're really trying to understand that. And I think that becomes so easily missed. And when we miss that, even if it's with our political enemies, even if it's the people we disagree with, then it betrays the fundamental principles of a progressive approach. If we think about a kind of progressive stance, social justice stance, as one about equality and one about valuing equality, then we need to recognize the equality and the intelligence and the thoughtfulness of those people, even though we may not like them. And that's not always easy.
Yeah.
And that's certainly not always to say that we have to agree with them or we kind of have to kind of comply with what they're saying. I mean, I think that stance of understanding can run alongside, and something I argue in the book very much, is that it can really run alongside a very radical challenge to more hierarchical, more authoritarian views. It's certainly not saying, we should just go along with it, but it is saying that we need to start from a position of understanding people, and to the extent that social justice perspectives, progressive perspectives, whether they're Green or Labour or Liberal Democrat, to the extent that they are demonizing and rubbishing the other perspectives, I don't think they're helping us move forward. I think what helps us move forward politically and create and tackle those kind of injustices that you're talking about is a kind of politics that is about understanding people, is about dialogue, is about having real conversations with people and really trying to understand where people are coming from. And I think that's the heart of a progressive, as a heart of an egalitarian outlook, is about understanding others rather than getting into blaming and rubbishing and demonizing others. So, that's that. And I guess that comes from my own history of coming from a progressive background, but also feeling that was kind of limited in some ways, and feeling that there were my parents are actually members of the Communist Party. So I was brought up with a lot of, Russia's great and America's bad and China's, that's wonderful. And, that politics, the reality is that politics, that very divisive politics, was not a good one. I remember my kids telling me about, what Mao Zedong, what happened in China, and, being absolutely horrified because, for my dad, he was a hero.
Yeah.
I mean, it was awful, as we know, and I think we all understand. But the question is, Rory, I think if we're thinking about developing a progressive politics, what is that going to look like? What kind of progressive politics is that? What form is that going to take? And I guess the book argues for a humanistic progressive politics.
So then, I mean, in terms of the reality of that, then, so the question then becomes, I think, to what extent then can we harness what we know from psychotherapy to making a better world?
Yeah.
So
how do we do it?
How do you do it? That's a very simple question, Mick, obviously.
Yeah. Number one, I think it has to be social emotional learning. So, I mean, we have schools that teach kids about geography and about history, but what they don't teach kids is about themselves and about their emotions and about how to relate to people. It might be a little bit on the PCR,
or whatever, personal and social development,
PCSR, curriculum, PHSR. But in terms of what we could be doing in schools, to educate kids about things like, and there are programs, there's really good evidence-based programs that we know can help develop kids' empathy for others by teaching them just things like, here's a picture of a little girl, what is she feeling? Let's spend a bit of time thinking about what she might be feeling. So that's one thing that I would love to see. And I would really hope, and my guess is that Labour, Green, I mean, their policies are very aware, I think, of mental health issues. And I would like to think there's a kind of open door there. And that's something we're certainly trying to do in Task, is to begin those dialogues with people and say, look, let's have more of that emotional education so that kids can come out of schools doing the things that we know can make a real difference to people's well-being. I mean, I'm sure in your research, Rory, as well, I'm sure interpersonal relationships come up as a major factor in psychological health and, mortality. I think interpersonal relationships is one of the best predictors of mortality, and a lot of people just don't learn how to have a relationship. So I think there's something there.
But loneliness is
loneliness, exactly, loneliness.
Equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Yeah, no, exactly right. And there's certain social factors again there. But I think teaching people how to develop relationships, how to empathize, how to form connections with others, we can do that. So that'd be one. I think there's something about positive parenting as well. Even before that is about, again, like I just think if a Martian came and saw what we were teaching people, like one of our most important roles is as a parent, and we just don't get any education about that.
We get zero education. I remember being horrified when I first became a parent. It's like, what do you do here?
I mean, I remember learning stuff about in the the classes about contractions, but in terms of emotionally bringing up a healthy child, the importance of things like attachment, the importance of security, so that kids can grow up feeling positive about themselves and feeling more able then to contribute to society. If somebody grows up in a way that means that they're scared and they're vulnerable and they're feeling that they're going to be attacked all the time because they've experienced abuse and adverse childhood experiences, then they're less likely, I think, to be able to contribute and share it with others. So I think positive parenting, I think looking, as I was saying before, looking at our emotional systems, and there's great organizations like Compassion in Politics, where what they do is they actually work with politicians to help them think about how they talk to each other, help them develop their self-care, help develop political systems that are more compassionate. Things like learning just really basic stuff like I don't know if you know nonviolent communication, which is about ways of talking to each other, which is just about, rather than blaming and saying, you've done this, I hate you, Rory, you're a this and you're a that, is actually saying, Rory, when you do this, I feel angry and it would be a lot better for me if you could do that. Really, again, simple kind of things where there is leverage to help create a society that is more caring, compassionate, understand. And I think that is so aligned. The book is about how this is so aligned with a progressive politic that I would really hope that over the coming years of the Labour government, and hopefully, I would hope for more years, that these things will become embedded in their politics so that we can work towards a more cooperative society, a more collaborative society, from all these different angles, rather than just that economic level is so important, and the social and the house, that is so important. But there's also that kind of emotional, psychological, which I think is missing. And to say it's missing isn't to say it's the most important bit, but is to say I think there's things that could be filled in there.
Yeah, but no, I agree entirely. Like, I think if we can have more compassion in politics, it makes all the difference. But the stark reality is the most powerful country in the world has just elected somebody who clearly doesn't embrace those policies. Discuss.
Is that a question, Rory?
No, that's just a bit, but I suppose the sad reality is that what you described is a way which, well, certainly I would totally embrace.
Yeah.
But what works in other countries is that when we live in a populist society, that doesn't hold for populism, because populism is about division, about
right-wing populism, authoritarian populism. Yeah,
I don't know if there's anything we can. Wait, so like the message is there anything that psychotherapy can help Donald Trump with? Really, question.
I mean, I think like a lot of people, I was really disheartened and gutted, wake up on whenever it was Thursday morning and Wednesday morning and, see that Trump's back. And of course, that's around the world, that more and more we see authoritarian leaders taking hold. And it scares me, it scares me about the the marginalization and the oppression that people are going to experience, things like women in the States. It's really terrifying what they may be facing, war, and of course the climate and ecological destruction and what that's going to mean for the next 4 or 5 years. And of course, going back to what you were saying, Rory, what that will then mean for people's mental health and well-being right down on the ground. And that really scares me. But I think what we can learn from therapy, I think what therapy can help us do is to try, I guess, and understand where that comes from. And however tempting it is to demonize it and demonize people like Trump, is to understand. I was over in the States last summer and we talked to a lot of people, and we were really shocked about how pro-Trump people were. But it was interesting to we talked to people and trying to understand where they're coming from and their fears. And it's too easy to say that people who vote for Trump are kind of idiots and don't know and just do whatever they're told.
Yeah, I don't think that.
I think there is obviously misinformation, but also people are scared. And I think if you approach them or interact with them on the basis that we're right and they're wrong, that's not going to change people. People aren't changed by being told they're idiots or being treated like idiots. At the end of the day, if we're going to address things like kind of authoritarian, we need to be able to engage with it in a way that not respects the ideas necessarily, but respects the people and tries to understand where people are coming from in a way that people feel valued and people feel, I guess, listened to. A lot of it was people really didn't feel listened to. I mean, a lot of it was, the people we spoke to, they just felt that they weren't listened to. They felt they were at the margins, and that's maybe a starting point to try and address that.
No, absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. I think it's whole communities been left behind or feeling that they've been left behind. And just this person saying exactly what you want to hear, I will do what X, Y, and Z, irrespective of whether it's possible or ethical. Of course, you're going to vote for it. So, yeah, I agree. We have to embrace and understand. And I think the Democrats in America really have a lot of thinking to do to see what I mean. Because I know a lot of Democrat friends who said that that's what their view was. It's in a way that the Democratic Party has left the working class behind. And in a way, is trying to understand that better so you can re-engage. I mean, it doesn't matter which side you're on, right or left, Republican or Democrat. It's just to live in a world which is more, hopefully, compassionate and takes it seriously, the challenges of our age, including, as you say, the climate change issue and a potential catastrophe. Okay, we're coming to almost the end of our time together. Like a couple of things to sort of bring it to a close. First of all, I often, because it's a research podcast, we're always keen to get some idea of, if you had all the money in the world type thing, in your field of endeavor, where should we be investing the research funding? What's our big unanswered questions?
If I had all the money and I couldn't just give all the money and share it out across all the people in the world, is that
you can't do that. It's for research. Sorry, I would like to do that. I would like to do that, but no.
So the research council, you've got to give this money to research. You can't share it out. I don't have a very interesting answer to that question. I think, there's a number of really major psychological distress, depression, anxiety. Finding the most effective ways of tackling that, I think, continues to be, would have to be top of the agenda. I think probably ways in which personalize and ways in which maybe rather than looking, is it this treatment or that treatment? There's some really interesting research, for instance, going on. James Delgadillo at the University of Sheffield, which is more and more about kind of how you personalize and how you can develop an understanding of the particular qualities that mean particular people will benefit most in the therapy. And I think that kind of personalization that could help us understand more, I think that's a real priority for research. That's where psychotherapy research is going now, is much more towards that personalization. I think rather than a big kind of therapy X versus therapy Y, it's who's going to do best in therapy X. And I think that's a really good way to spend money and help address some of these kind of mental health issues. But it would be amazing to overcome that, wouldn't it? Or to address that as much as possible.
Yeah, no, well, that would be amazing. I mean, because obviously the whole field of doesn't matter what, as you say, what brand of therapy it is, it's trying to have a more tailored approach, genuinely having a personalized approach where we have best chances of success and helping those who are most vulnerable. So one last question, Mick, but before I do, as a sort of shout out, anyone wants to hear Mick talking about this and more about social change stuff, Mick's going to be speaking at the UK Council for Psychotherapy annual conference next Saturday. Saturday the 23rd of November. That's in London. I think you can find all the details, I assume, if you Google that if you want to attend that. So just shout that out before I ask the final question. So, Mick, the final question we try and do is unrelated, and I haven't given you no warning that this question is
It's not
coming.
about my cat, is it?
No, it's not about your cat, but I'll ask an easy one. It's give them a sort of we start off being a bit reflective.
Yeah.
And suppose that question is, if you're thinking back to what advice you would give your younger self, so say 16 or 18-year-old, what advice would you give and why?
About mental health.
Well, any aspect of your life, any aspect.
It's a really difficult. I know it's a really, What would I want to know? What would be useful to know?
Yeah, but what would you wish that your
What would you say, Rory?
Huh?
What would you say to that? I will answer that, but you tell me what you'd say first.
Hold on, I'm asking the question here. No, I would say for me to be less self-critical, and that actually the world, because the thing obviously I wish I had known was as an adolescent how super sensitive you are to criticism and stuff going on in your life. So I wish I'd learned that. Well, but I suppose at that stage we didn't know. When I was 16, we didn't know the brain was still developing and the pruning was still going on, and the mismatch between emotion processing and capacity to cognitively do things. So that would be my answer.
That's a good answer. That's a really good answer. You know what I say, Roy, and it's something we haven't talked about at all, but actually, like myself personally, I've struggled with mental health issues over kind of coming and going over time, particularly around anxiety. I think what I wish I'd known, genuinely wish I'd known when I was 15 or 16, was more about having more confidence to follow down routes to address that. Like, I think the kind of anxieties that I had when I was 15, 16 got so embedded that I never, by the time I kind of in my 20s, 30s, 40s kind of addressed them, I probably didn't get right down into the roots that maybe I could have done when I was younger. When I was 15, I went off to the Tavistock and had this psychoanalytic therapy that was very kind of talking about my parents thing, and just wasn't the right therapy. And, I think if I'd known to pursue particular, like, for instance, cognitive behavioral pathways, which can be really good for anxiety. I wish I'd known that. I wish I'd known that can be really helpful. And I wish I'd kind of really pursued that. I did try that in my 20s and it was helpful. But I think just in terms of my own mental health, that would have been, a good thing. And I'm sure that's kind of informed my journey and kind of my desire to kind of work with other people around that and to kind of disseminate knowledge in a public way, Rob, because I think probably I felt that knowledge, or some of that knowledge, was kind of guarded in that professional sphere rather than being disseminated out. And like the wonderful work that MQ's doing about kind of making knowledge about mental health and many other organizations widely available, I think it's just so important. I wish there'd been more of that when I was a kid. Yeah,
well, that's a great answer for you thinking it wasn't going to be that great an answer. It turned into a really good one, I think, and a really important message as well. So on that note, Mike, huge thanks for taking the time to spend with us today. And again, just a shout out for Mick's latest book. So it's a Psychology at the Heart of Social Change, Developing a Progressive Vision for Society. Okay, so thanks a million and all the very best.
Thanks, Roy. Thanks, Craig. Really good to talk to you both.
Thanks.